On the evening of May 20th, 1947, the body of 22-year-old Christina Kettlewell was discovered 150 feet from her honeymoon cottage, submerged in just 9 inches of water by the banks of a river in Severn Falls, Ontario. Christina Mocon, who resided in Mimico, Ontario, worked at a bank and was regarded as a competent employee. On May 12th, 1947, she eloped with John Ray Kettlewell, a 26-year-old war veteran known as Jack, after 3 years of acquaintance. Christina's family had reservations about the marriage. Ronald Barrie, Jack's best friend and a 28-year-old immigrant from Italy, was a professional ballroom dancer. Upon his arrival in Canada, he shed his old identity and became known as Ronald Eugene Barrie. Aside from his work as a dancer, he also ventured into the world of insurance sales. By day, he dazzled on stage. By night, he peddled policies trying to secure a stable income. As time went on, Ronald's ambitions grew. He dove into real estate, believing that building houses would pave the way for his financial freedom. However, the journey was fraught with challenges. Ronald invested heavily in construction, pouring his savings into projects that often spiraled out of control. The excitement of creation soon turned into despair as he found himself unable to secure enough funds to complete the very homes he had envisioned. In the summer of 1946, Ronald made a desperate decision. He purchased a charming cottage at Dinnertime Rapids, hoping it would provide a steady stream of income. The picturesque location seemed perfect for summer rentals, and he envisioned families enjoying the serene landscape that surrounded him. Yet as the days turned into weeks, Ronald's struggles deepened. He found himself borrowing money from friends and acquaintances, each loan a lifeline that became increasingly difficult to repay. Whispers of his financial troubles began to circulate, and the burden of his debts weighed heavily on his shoulders. Despite his charismatic smile and the grace of a dancer, he felt trapped in a relentless cycle of obligation and despair. As the seasons changed, so did Ronald's fortunes. The cottage, while beautiful, did not bring in the income he had hoped for. It was rumored that Jack, Christina, and Ronald spent an excessive amount of time together, leading Christina's sister, Helen, to suggest that the family suspected Ronald might have feelings for Christina. Following the elopement, the Kettlewells spent the next few days at an apartment in Toronto on Tyndall Avenue. Bizarrely, Ronald joined them for the entirety of their honeymoon, and on May 17th, the trio headed out to Ronald's remote cottage in Severn Falls, only accessible by boat. During their time at the cottage, it's reported that Christina began to act out of character. She would go into crying fits while, at other times, she seemed completely dazed. Evidence suggests that Christina had conversations with Ronald about whether or not Jack truly loved her. On May 20th, Christina disappeared from the cottage, curiously on the same day that Ronald's cottage mysteriously caught fire. Ronald returned to the cabin to find a disoriented Jack sitting in the cabin with an apparent head injury and pulled him out of the blaze. He looked for Christina, but couldn't find her anywhere in the cottage. Ronald recalled that the cottage burned to the ground in just an hour. He took Jack on a boat to Severn Falls to reach a car to drive him to the hospital and contacted the police. It was then that Ronald discovered that the situation became even worse. That evening, Christina's body was found in 9 inches of water, just 150 feet away from the cottage by Neville Sweet. Her body was free from burns or any signs of violence. An official autopsy found traces of codeine in her stomach, but her ultimate cause of death was declared a drowning. Interesting, Major Lawrence Scarterfield, who tried to help put out the fire in the cottage, said he saw no signs of Christina's body in the area when he went to fetch water from the river to help with the flames just hours earlier. Jack, Ronald, and 20 other people were questioned by police in connection with the case. Jack was interrogated by the police for 3 hours after being released from the hospital, where he was treated for burns, shock, a head injury, and apparent drugging. However, Jack claimed to not remember anything that occurred after 11 a.m. on the day of Christina's death. Ronald was questioned by the police for a grueling 13 hours, in which he provided a 3,000-word statement that the police would describe as fantastic. On June 19th, an inquest into Christina's death began, which became quite the spectacle. The public packed not only the courtroom, but the grounds outside, with some even approaching Jack and Ronald, the main witnesses, for autographs. It should be noted that Jack and Ronald were not on trial for murder. This was simply a case to determine whether or not foul play had been involved in Christina's death. While the highly sensationalized investigation uncovered many interesting bits of information, the jury of the inquest ultimately could not agree on whether Christina's death was the result of foul play or not, stating, because the post-mortem examination disclosed codeine in the stomach of the deceased, and due to the suspicious fact that she was found drowned, this jury is unable to decide on the evidence given whether or not foul means were employed in her death. Jack and Ronald were in the clear, as there was no evidence implicating either of them in the death. But their relationships to both Christina and each other were thoroughly exposed in the process. The police report claims that there were signs and evidence that Christina was very distressed by the unnatural conduct of her husband and Barrie. Theories Christina may have been dealing with mental illness and killed herself. The largest pieces of evidence that Christina may have killed herself are the several suicide notes written prior to her untimely end that were uncovered during the inquest. The first note, written on Easter Sunday before their engagement and about 5 weeks before the wedding, was addressed to Ronald. In it, she writes that she tried to poison herself and talks about the uncertainty of receiving a proposal from Jack. In it, she claims, "This will be the best way out, as I cannot bear to see another girl have him." Jack recalls Christina being sick that day, but claimed in his testimony that he was unaware of the suicide note. She wrote another suicide note at the end of April. This time, her intention, as detailed in the note, was to not only kill herself, but Jack as well. In this note, also addressed to Ronald, she wrote, "When you love someone, you really love him, and I know there is no one for me but Jack, and if I cannot have him, I do not intend anyone else to. I waited, as you might say, in the hope that Jack would ask me to marry him, but I now realize I am just a passing fancy." The last note was written the day before she died. It was addressed to a Mrs. Thomas, who owned a home in Mimico that Christina and Jack stayed in for a little bit. Once done, Christina asked Ronald to mail the letter for her. She writes, "Ronnie is in the boat outside somewhere. By the time he gets back, everything will be all over with. He must have been afraid something would happen, because he is staying an extra day to make sure we go back to Toronto with him." All notes were confirmed by a handwriting expert to have been signed by Christina. Ronald held on to all the notes from Christina, but he never told Jack about them until the inquest. Strangely, Ronald was able to and chose to save the letters from his burning cottage. Perhaps Jack and Ronald were not so innocent. The first bit of evidence that suggests the duo may have planned this is a series of insurance policies purchased before Christina's death. Jack took out 2 separate life insurance policies on himself and Christina before the marriage. Each $5,000 policy contained a double indemnity clause, which would allow the beneficiary to collect twice the amount if the cause of death was accidental, a sum worth around $200,000 today. Strangely, Ronald was the beneficiary listed on both policies. Ronald had also taken out a $5,000 insurance policy on his cottage that would later mysteriously burn down and name Jack as his beneficiary. It should be noted that Ronald had failed careers in both construction and insurance. Additionally, the inquest revealed that Jack had given his war gratuity, a payment to Canadian servicemen when discharged, to Ronald, and that Jack had removed all of his family from his will for reasons unknown. Also, Christina's wedding ring became a suspicious detail in the inquest, as it was never recovered. Reports differ as to whether Ronald purchased the ring for Christina or if Jack borrowed the ring from a married friend, and the true price of the ring is also debated, ranging from $1,000 to $13,000. Nevertheless, it was never found after Christina's death. Jack's statement to the police after the fire was another fascinating exhibit entered into the inquest. In the statement, Jack states that he and Ronald had been in an intimate relationship for some time. However, in court, Jack claimed he was coerced to make that statement, as the police wanted to build that story in their report. The police commissioner did touch on this relationship in the report of Christina's case. In it, he writes that the relationship between Jack and Ronald was, to put it mildly, to be unnatural. There was no evidence to prove this relationship, but it was highly suspected. In the inquest, Crown Counsel C.P. Hope didn't believe Jack was coerced and suggested that the two were lovers. Jack finally agreed to this after Hope hammered him with questions. The Toronto Star describes the questioning in an article from June 20th. When Kettlewell, after vigorous questioning, agreed with Mr. Hope's repeated suggestion that he and Ronald were male lovers, the fantastic triangle of twisted and thwarted emotions took shape. The Radlett murder, also known as the Elstree murder, was an 1823 murder in Radlett, Hertfordshire, England. The victim, William Ware, was born in 1779. He is a gambler and a solicitor at Lyon's Inn. John Thurtell, on the other hand, was also born in 1794. John Thurtell was a sports promoter, amateur boxer, a former Royal Marine officer, and a son of the mayor of Norwich. Thurtell owed Ware a gambling debt of £300, an immense sum at the time, equivalent to £30,000 in 2025, which he believed Ware had gained by cheating. Whatever the truth, when Ware demanded the money, Thurtell decided to murder him rather than pay up. Thurtell invited Ware to join him and his friends, Joseph Hunt, a tavern landlord, and William Probert, a former convict and alcohol merchant, for a weekend of gambling at Probert's cottage at the site of Oaks Close off Gills Hill Lane, subsequently popularly known as Murder Lane, Radlett. On 24th of October, 1823, they journeyed from London in Thurtell's horse-drawn gig, but Ware was killed in a dark lane just short of their destination. Thurtell shot Ware in the face with a flintlock muff pistol, but this failed to kill him. Ware escaped from the gig but did not get far before Thurtell caught him. As Ware lay injured, Thurtell slit his throat with a knife before driving the pistol into his head with such force that his brains were dashed over the ground. Assisted by Hunt and Probert, he hid the corpse in a pond near the cottage. This hiding place was judged too unsafe for Probert, however, and the body was moved to another pond in Elstree. By this time, both weapons had been found, as Thurtell had left them on the road. The pistol was one of a pair, the other still in Thurtell's possession. The culprits were identified and caught. Hunt himself led the authorities to the body. Thurtell, Hunt, and Probert were indicted for murder. The grand jury's foreman which indicted them was William Lamb, who as Lord Melbourne would later become Prime Minister. The three were tried at Hertford Assize Court. Even though Hunt had cooperated the most with the authorities, it was Probert who was offered the chance to save himself by turning King's evidence against the other two in exchange for freedom. Hunt was tried as an accessory to murder. His counsel was Frederick Thesiger, a future Lord Chancellor, head of the English judiciary. The murder case attracted unprecedented publicity, to the point where questions were raised as to whether the defendants could have a fair trial. Construction of a gallows was begun even before the trial started. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Park, lamented, "If these statements of evidence before trial which corrupt the purity of the administration of justice in its source are not checked, I tremble for the fate of our country." Nevertheless, he allowed Thurtell and Hunt to be convicted. Thurtell and his associates' actions, pursuant to the murder, were as widely reported and commented upon as the crime itself. Having temporarily disposed of Ware's corpse, the trio entered the house. Hunt was introduced to Mrs. Probert. Directions were given to cook some pork chops for supper, and then Thurtell took the two men to the field, where they rifled the body and left it lying enveloped in the sack. After supper, a jovial evening was spent. Hunt sang several songs over the grog, and Thurtell gallantly presented Mrs. Probert with the gold chain he had taken from the body. Thurtell was hanged on the 9th of January, 1824, aged 29, by Thomas Cheshire, assisting Marsh James Foxon. Having always denied his crime, he admitted it on the gallows. On the day after his death, Thurtell's body was dissected, part of the sentence for murders at the time. A waxwork of his body was displayed in Madame Tussauds for 150 years. Although Thurtell had been popular and had received public sympathy, some of his relatives still chose to change their names to avoid being associated with him. Hunt was also sentenced to death, but in recognition of his cooperation, his sentence was commuted to transportation to an Australian penal colony for life. He was taken to Botany Bay, where he was rehabilitated. After serving his time, Hunt gained his freedom and started a life in Australia, marrying and raising a son and a daughter. He became such a respected man that he became a police constable. Hunt died in 1861. Probert was never punished for Ware's death. However, reports of his involvement in the newspapers meant he was reviled and became a social outcast. Unable to find work, Probert resorted to crime to support himself and his wife, and in 1825 at 33, was hanged at Newgate Prison for stealing a horse worth 25 pounds from a relative.